Okay, it looks like our meeting is being live streamed.
Okay, well, it is 7 a.m. and I'm going to call this Transportation Policy Board meeting to order on February 9th, 2022. Let's start with some introductions. I'll turn it over to Mark.
All right. Well, let's start with you, Chair Ryder, representing Lacey.
Andy Ryder, Miriam Lacey.
City of Olympia
Danny Madrone, Olympia City Council.
and City of Tumwater
Peter Agaviton with us.
and City of Tenino.
John O'Callahan representing the great city of Tenino.
And Yelm.
Brian Hess representing Yelm.
And Joseph, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself too, please?
Yes, I'm Joseph Richardson, and I'm on the Elm City Council.
Great, thank you. Intercity Transit
Don Melnick, authority member.
and Port of Olympia.
I think Joe, you're muted.
Well, that's interesting. Joe Downing, Port of Olympia, and I also see my fellow commissioner, Amy Evans. Amy, do we have a snafu? Am I assigned or are you assigned?
I thought I was, but
Okay, well, that could well be.
were-
And, you know, we did our
Commissioner Downing,
assignments at the beginning of the
told
year.
that-
So,
that
Pardon?
we were told that Amy was going to be the primary this.
okay,
this-
great. That means I'm off the hook. And because of the fact how things work at the port, you know, it's not really good for two commissioners to attend a meeting without it being noticed. So I'm going to say, you know, I've enjoyed my time on Transportation Policy Board, and, you know, Amy's going to have a lot of fun with this. And, you know, I'm going to bid my adieu at this time. I do want to say one tiny thing, though, if I may, as a member of the public, may I?
Sure. Go ahead,
Okay.
real quick.
Interesting thing happened yesterday. My wife went up to Tacoma for a hair appointment. And so there was an accident southbound right at that bridge where the railroad, where you're familiar with DuPont with the southbound. Anyway, so there's a tractor trailer spilled at just about noontime. And she got done with her hair appointment she got back on the freeway at 4 o'clock and did not get back home until 7 o'clock. And it took all afternoon to move that tractor trailer. So I don't know why, but you know, when we talk about transportation, you know, that's one of the issues is how fast can you clear up a mess? Because we all know that I-5 is super overburdened anyway. And so when we have an incident like this, I mean, I'm not sure it really pertains to the Transportation Policy Board, but I just want to, you know, tell you that story, that part of the problem is that the freeways are so full. And the other part of the problem is, you know, we need, you might say, a rapid response to, I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands of people that burned up their afternoon, you know, and it was literally, it was an 8-mile backup. And of course, I'm on my phone with my wife and the traffic's moving 5 miles an hour. She's doing 1 mile in 20 minutes. And, you know, it was really bad.
Well,
But anyway, that's my
Thanks for that.
story. I'll
Joe.
stick with
Appreciate
it.
it. You know, we've never had a presentation about WashDOT's reaction to incidences and, you know, what the time takes. And you brought up a really good point. It'd be nice to hear from the state on, you know, what their plan is and so on and so forth. So we appreciate you and everything you've done, Joe. I know we know we're in good hands with Amy, but thanks for that, and we'll make that note.
thanks,
Okay.
Joe. Good morning.
Thank
I'm
you
Amy
very much. Joe Downing out.
Okay.
Hi, Joe. I'm Amy Evans, Port of Olympia.
Good morning, Amy. State government representative.
Hi, Kevin Dragon with the State of Washington's Department of Enterprise Services. Welcome. Or good
And
morning.
Washington State Department of Transportation. I see Gaius Sonoy is on. He might have some microphone issues if,
You still dealing with
Can
the
you hear me,
cleanup?
Mark?
yes, now we can. Yes. Okay. Business representative
Good morning. I'm Renee Radcliffe Sinclair, business rep.
and our emeritus rep.
Well, good morning, everyone. This is Pete Komet.
And I'm scanning real quick to make sure I didn't miss anyone. I don't believe I did.
Mark, our county commissioner, has joined us as well.
Oh, okay. And Thurston County.
Hi, Carolina Mejia, Thurston County Commissioner. I'm having issues with my camera. So just.
We see that. It looks like there's a ghost in your room.
You're scaring us. It's,
Okay.
thank you, Carolina.
Vino, will you do introduce staff?
Yeah, some are still coming in, but I have Jessica Gould and Rob LaFontaine from Intercity Transit, Sophie Stimpson and Michelle Swanson from the City of Olympia, Matt Unzelman from Thurston County, Mary Heather Ames from Tumwater. Did I miss any of our jurisdictional partners? Okay. And then for TRPC staff, you've met Mark Daly, our executive director, and I'm Vina Tabbitt, the deputy director. We also have Karen Parkhurst here. Berlina Lucas and Dorinda O'Sullivan are here as well, providing administrative support. We have Allison Osterberg, Paul Brewster, and I think that's all I have, but I saw people might have been coming in as I was talking.
Sounds good. Do you have any reports, Executive Director?
Yes, so we've got a lot of new members on both the Transportation Policy Board and Council. And so Berlina will be reaching out to new members to do an orientation with me. When new people come on, we like to have an opportunity to sit down one-on-one, talk a little bit more about what we do on Policy Board and Council, and just help to get acquainted with your new role on Policy Board. And so if Berlina hasn't reached out to you yet, she will be shortly. Also, I wanted to hand it over to Karen, since we don't have a legislative update. We had a pretty important piece of legislation drop yesterday, a transportation package. We had heard that this might be coming, what they were calling kind of a mini package. Mini and transportation is still a pretty large package, and it includes 75 million as the next step for our highest priority, the I-5 Mounts Road to Tumwater. So a very good sign that that project has gotten the kind of attention it needs from the state legislature. And a lot of our other priorities, like Karen will point out, transit got some big boost in this package. But Karen, could you tell us a little bit about some of the highlights?
Sure. I think it's important to remember that this is, whenever we look at budgets, it can be really confusing when you're trying to look online. This is separate from and in addition to the supplemental budget, the transportation budget that the legislature will be considering as well. So you have to kind of put them together to see what the whole package is. I would say that we have heard from both sides, and this is not a bipartisan bill. So I'm expecting that we're going to hear from both sides and continue to do that. But it's been my experience, I'm just going to put my opinion here, that we do really well when both sides are talking to each other and coming up with creative solutions for the whole area. So there's about $1 billion. This is a 16-year package. So when you think of this, you're dividing it up across biennia. About $1 billion for active transportation, $1 billion for ferries, especially electrification of the ferries, $3 billion for transit, $150 million for high-speed rail, and the I-5 work that we talked about. We also have continued and increased funding for commute trip reduction and transportation demand management, which are work that we do for new people. We are the lead agency for the commute trip reduction program on behalf of Olympia, Lacey, Tumwater, and Thurston County, who are affected on it. There's also a program that says kids ride free. So basically anyone under the age of 18 can ride transit and ferries free if this moves forward. That's what's proposed. This also, I want to talk a little bit about the revenue side, and there's no increase in the gas tax. There isn't, they aren't implementing a per mile charge for this bill. Basically, this is tied. It was very clear when they were announcing it that this is tied very closely to the climate commitment legislation that was passed last year. And so 5.4 billion of the revenue comes from our largest polluters, having them pay for the impact that that has on our communities. Especially, we are finding that often people of low income, people with disabilities, people of color are adversely affected by climate issues. There's also a $2 billion one-time transfer from the general fund. You may have heard that the general fund is booming, the transportation fund not so much. And so this is a one-time transfer. There were suggestions that that happen more often, but for this one, it's one time. They also have set up some pots of money. There's an anticipation of the funding coming from the federal government. And so they've set up $3.4 billion coming in from the feds, and what those programs will look like that one hopes will have a chance to apply for. And then this was interesting to me because I really didn't understand it before hearing the conversation yesterday, but that is that we have refineries in the state of Washington, and we have pollution that comes from those refineries. And so in this instance, we will be putting a charge on gas that is exported outside of Washington. So for those people in other states around us that are taking advantage of that gas, there's also a number of fees, enhanced driver's license, a few other ones, but I think it will be quite interesting. There is funding, I believe, to complete the intercity transit maintenance facility. I think that number has been bantied about, so I'm not sure if it actually takes care of every cent of that, but there's a substantial amount of money for that. So it is an interesting piece, and we're going to be watching it throughout the rest of session as we're watching other pieces of legislation. There's a hearing in Senate Transportation on Thursday morning at 8 o'clock. I'm happy to send out information for that. Remember that all testimony is via Zoom or other electronic means. And so if you would like to testify about the bill, ask questions about the bill, suggest amendments, then you have that opportunity. From our staff, Veronica Jarvis will be doing part of the testimony. I don't know if Mark will be there, but we'll sort of see. And this isn't the only
I'll be
hearing it will ever
testifying
have.
too.
That's what I thought, that you were also testifying. So we'll be hearing
Karen,
more about this.
Can you tell us what our friends on the right are objecting to? You said this is not partisan.
What we heard, and I'm just saying what I've heard, and that is that they weren't part of the conversation, that there were some issues. So there are certain things that the gas tax can fund. There's always an interest in, okay, if it can be funded by the gas tax, let's not use other revenues for it. So I heard that there were some current concern on the part of the minority party that they wanted to use those funds more interchangeably. So I assume that we're going to hear a lot from them on this. I also want to mention that if you would like to listen to the press conference yesterday, TVW has it on tape. And so very easy to go and look at that. We do not have details as far as what will be coming to which jurisdictions, the grant funds that are hopefully going to be available. The details of those aren't there yet. And so we're still watching that. I think we have a hand up, Mr. Chair, City of Yelm.
Go ahead.
Brian?
I don't see it on my side.
I apologize. that I did that, but also just to kind of add, there was when she was talking about from the other side, I do know that one of the challenges with the legislations going through is in the wording in reference to how the funding is spent. Currently, as you know, the gas tax, it is very specific that the money collected for the gas tax is used for roads, not transportation. When they're looking at the new bill, in particular for the pay by mile and various other things, the words are getting interchanged, transportation and road. And that happens to be the big challenge, because if you bring in the pay per mile, which I have studied, I agree with, I've been trying to communicate with some people on that, because I know the concerns that they have with it. We won't go into that right now. But one of the big things is the wording. And so when you start throwing transportation in, and you're going to get rid of the gas tax, because that's one of the things that occurs, you all of a sudden have your funding that, yes, you start getting a lot of money, but transportation is bicycle lanes, buses, light rail, all these other things. And so now money that was supposed to be dedicated for road maintenance all of a sudden becomes less. And that is one of the challenges. And I just wanted to bring that up.
Thanks,
you,
Brian.
Brett.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll reach out to Representative Barkus. You know, we have a great relationship with him, and we'll check in, see some more of those concerns and see what we can do to.
Yes. He was otherwise engaged when I called him yesterday.
I'm sure.
He was very busy with this. So I just told you what I heard.
This did catch us a little by surprise. We've been talking to, you know, everyone in transportation like we do. And, you know, we were hopeful that maybe, you know, that something was going to happen, but this is a lot bigger and, you know, yeah, definitely more robust than we were expecting. That's for sure.
I tried my best, you know, sneaking around to everyone I know techniques, and I couldn't get information until the press conference at 1. So it was hard. I think Renee has her hand up, Mr.
ahead,
Chair.
Yeah, I would just mention that Andrew Barkus is the only one who released a statement yesterday. And Karen, if you'd like to see that, I can send it to you after this meeting.
Okay, great.
yes,
Yes.
please.
So again, I didn't want to misrepresent. I just told you what I had heard yesterday in my begging people for information. And so,
Well,
and for
what I
those
thought
who
was-
don't know, I was just going to mention that the 18th Amendment requires that gas tax money be used for road purposes. We have interpreted that to include ferries in this state, but other pieces are not funded with the gas tax. So that's the conversation that our Yelm representative, I believe, was talking about, is where do you use those monies and what happens if you mush them together? And that was the bigger conversation that was happening around, do we transfer money from the general fund to transportation? And should that be something we can just do whenever, or should it be a specific action? So we'll be keeping you informed when we know things soon, right?
Well, thanks for the update. I know that this wasn't on our agenda, but this is a really big piece of what we've been talking about for a while. It was interesting to see the high-speed train money in there, especially when Congresswoman Strickland had just put out a piece saying, hey, state legislature, you need to do this so we can take advantage of the federal funds. And it does seem like this package is doing just that, trying to get us ready for the federal funds that we know are coming. So from that standpoint, it's really good news for the state of Washington, because we were worried we're going to miss out on the federal funds that we know are coming our way. Is there any other announcement?
No, thank you for the extra time on that. We wanted to make sure members heard about that.
Great. Let's see. Next up is, can I get a motion for the approval of today's agenda?
So
moved.
moved, John O'Callahan.
Don Melnick.
Second.
We got a motion from John and a second from Danny. Is there any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed? And that motion unanimously carries. Next up is the approval of the meeting notes from January 12th. Give me a
Move
motion.
approval, John O'Callahan.
Is there a second?
Second, this is Pete.
It's Been moved by John, second by Pete. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed? Hearing none, then that motion unanimously carries as well. Now we're up to the public comment period. We did not receive any public comment. No one signed up for public comment. I'm just checking back in as of right now. Nothing. Okay. Then we'll go out to our next agenda item, which is the 2022 election of officers. First up, it will be the election of chair. Is there any nominations? Pete?
I nominate Andy Ryder.
I'll second that.
Are there any other nominations?
Okay, I'll nominate Andy Ryder.
Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, I'm going to close the nominations for chair. All in favor of Andy Ryder to be chair for another year, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? Then that motion unanimously carries. Next up is the election for vice chair. I'm going to nominate Danny Madrone for vice chair. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, I'm going to close the nominations for vice chair. All in favor of Danny Madrone for vice chair, please signify by saying aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed? Then that motion unanimously carries.
Thanks, y'all.
Then next up is the nomination for second vice chair. Are there any nominations? Pete?
Yeah, I would like to nominate Renee for second vice chair.
Are there
Second,
any
John
oth-
O'Callahan.
Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, I'm going to close nominations for second vice chair. All in favor of Renee Sinclair for second vice chair, signify by saying aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed? And that motion unanimously carries as well. Congratulations, Danny and Renee, and I look forward to working with you for this next year. So next up is our third.
I'm sorry, Chair. Berlina just let me know. I don't think we had a second for Danny, just for process. We had your nomination, but the motion didn't have a second. So if we could just clarify that.
I didn't think they required a second.
No.
We don't.
I don't
Okay.
think it does either.
Just a nomination. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a
Doesn't require a
nomination.
All right. Thanks.
second. So now we'll go up to our Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan presentation.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Committee. Allison Osterberg, Senior Planner at Thurston Regional Planning Council. And I'm just going to bring up my screen here. Great. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Pleased to be here this morning to give you all an update on what's going on with the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. And because I know we've got some folks on the Transportation Policy Board who are new, maybe less familiar with the Climate Mitigation Plan, I'll give a bit of background on where we're at, a little bit of a progress report on work that's been done over the past year, and some information about what's being set up for the next year. And then happy to take any questions or conversation that folks have about the climate mitigation plan. So just for a little bit of context, the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan is a partnership among Thurston County, Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater. And it came out of a recognition that through a lot of work that we've been doing in our region, recognizing that climate change is posing a risk to some of our community goals. And certainly in the past year, we've experienced some pretty extreme climate impacts through heat, through flooding, through various climate impacts. And those are things that impact our public health, they impact our infrastructure, they pose costs to our community and a threat to our community. And there are many ways that we are preparing for those impacts, but at the same time, there's a recognition that the way that we use energy in our region contributes to climate change. And so the climate mitigation plan is an attempt to understand how we're contributing to climate change and identifying ways to limit our own local contributions in a way that's consistent with what the conversation or science has said is needed to maintain our climate in a way that's will help us to thrive long term. So the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan sets goals and identified strategies and actions to reduce local sources of greenhouse gas emissions in a way that'll help limit our vulnerability long term, but also to do it in a way that supports our community goals and will make us more resilient as a region going forward. The Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan was completed at the end of 2020. It included a look at the sources of our emissions, where they come from in our region. We set targets for reducing those emissions, and it includes 22 strategies and over 70 actions. Like I mentioned, it's a partnership between 4 jurisdictions, so it's not a completely countywide, all the jurisdictions in Thurston County plan. It's not a TRPC plan. The TRPC was brought on to help coordinate that effort. And at the end of that process, the 4 jurisdictions said that they wanted to continue working together to implement the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. And so that's some of the work we've been figuring out over the past year, how that works. Those greenhouse gas emission targets, which TRPC did adopt, are to reduce community-wide emissions using 2015 as a baseline. And so our goals are to reduce emissions 45% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. And our emissions have been going up since 2015 in general. So I like to think of it, if you need a number to think of, we need to get down by half in about the next 10 years. And that's really important. I think there's a lot of science behind showing that that's the next 10 years is pretty critical to see some steep reductions to avoid some of the worst impacts that could be predicted through climate change. Our regional framework for climate mitigation relies on a few different planks, what I like to say are planks. So our focus is on greening our grid, so shifting our energy to renewable sources that are non-polluting. And then shifting the way that the energy uses we use to that cleaner grid. So shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. We also are looking to live lighter, so live in a way in denser urban networks where we can reduce our reliance on driving, making it easier to walk, bicycle, telework, and ways that reduce waste as well. And another kind of key plank to the climate plan is storing carbon. There was a lot of discussion in the plan about tapping the resources we have in our region, in our ecosystems, in forests and agriculture, in our prairies. And all of those ecosystems naturally store carbon in soil, in vegetation. And there's a lot of work going on in the region for many reasons for the benefits of these ecosystems. And so also looking at those as a climate mitigation strategy. And underlying all that is our need to build our local capacity and resilience. So continuing to provide coordinated leadership on climate action, continuing to understand what our impacts are, and having that capacity locally to respond to climate change, and doing all that in a way that is equitably distributing the costs and benefits of both climate impacts and climate mitigation action. So for this board, just want to dive in a little bit on the specifics related to transportation. We've got 5 strategies in the transportation sector. The first is to set land use policies that support increased density and efficient transportation networks. The second is increasing the overall efficiency of our transportation system. The third is increasing the adoption of electric vehicles. The fourth is increasing the use of public transit. And the fifth strategy is to increase the use of active forms of travel like bicycling and walking. And all of these strategies should look really familiar. This is all work that in our region we've been working on in different capacities for a long time. And I think the new part here is just thinking about that it also has an impact on our climate strategy and is really crucial to reducing our emissions. So that's it for kind of the background on the plan. We released a progress report looking back at some of the work from the past year that was included in your packet. But I'll hit some of the highlights now, and folks might have other stuff that they want to bring up. I'd love to hear about what's going on in other folks in your organizations and in your communities. But for 2021, by February, all 4 of the jurisdictions had approved the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. And as I mentioned, they also approved an interlocal agreement to continue coordinating around climate mitigation. For this year, the areas of focus have really kind of been on getting our ducks in a row. So for the jurisdictions, understanding within that plan, unpacking it, beginning to incorporate it into existing programs, thinking about priorities, thinking about the staff that's needed, and sort of orienting things. How should budgets be aligned? How should staffing be changed to respond to the needs that were identified in the climate mitigation plan? And that's work that all 4 of those jurisdictions have been doing over the past year. Looking at our overall emissions, the data we have has been developed in the past by a community group, the Thurston Climate Action Team, that uses a protocol, a standard protocol for assessing greenhouse gas emissions. And looking countywide, the latest data we have from them is from 2019. So it's before the pandemic, before the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan was developed. But what we see generally with this trend is that our emissions, here's our baseline year of 2015, but they've been going up. And that was true in 2019. So we are at about 3.3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's not the direction we want to be going in. We want to be going down, as I mentioned, reduced to by 45% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. So the more we go up, the more we have to come down. Looking at our overall sources of emissions, this is our sector-based emissions inventory, and energy use in buildings continues to be our largest source of emissions. And that's likely to maybe change in the future. Right now, it's because we get our electricity and our energy from Puget Sound Energy. Part of Puget Sound Energy's, the way they get power is from coal and from natural gas. There's legislation at the state level that puts them on a timeline to shift to renewable energy, and that will make a big difference in the 62% wedge for us. But the second largest source of emissions in our region, about 1/3 of our emissions come from transportation. It's mostly from passenger vehicles, people driving gas-powered cars. And so a big thing that we can do locally, a thing we focused on in the plan, is hitting those transportation strategies. Solid waste and agriculture account for much smaller portions of our greenhouse gas emissions. For our 2021 progress report, we were able to look at some metrics from 2020 and some of it even from 2021. So we have vehicle miles traveled is one of our performance metrics. And we did see a pretty dramatic drop in 2020 in vehicle miles traveled for our region. That had to do with the start of the pandemic. Most people, many people in our region changing their travel habits, working from home, and VMT really went down a lot. And so even going back, looking from 2015 to 2020, we're seeing overall an 11% reduction in VMT. That technically means we're on track to meet our goals in the climate mitigation plan. However, it's something we're going to want to track long term. We know that transportation patterns have increased again since that low of the pandemic. The second performance metric that we track or area is around the uptake of electric vehicles. And we definitely are seeing a lot more electric vehicles in our community, but yet there's still a really, really small percentage of overall vehicles. So we are starting, what we'll probably start doing in the future is tracking this on an annual basis. But as of this is the first year we're doing it right now, only about 1% of vehicles registered in Thurston County are electric vehicles. And on the land use side, we did a review this past year through our Buildable Lands program, the Buildable Lands report, that looked at patterns of growth and compared them against our Sustainable Thurston land use goals. And what we see is that we are seeing more concentrated, though we are seeing more concentrated development in our urban areas, we're not on track to meet our goals for concentrating development in our urban areas. So right now, about 48% of our development that's in our urban areas, new development, is occurring in a city center or an urban corridor where we have the most frequent transit and the easiest access. And we'd like that to be up to 72%. So we're lagging behind on that one. Similarly, we're still seeing growth outside of our urban growth areas. It's a lower percent. It's about 14% of our growth is happening outside of urban growth area boundaries, but our target for this through Sustainable Thurston is 5%. And so that's kind of, that 14% has held pretty steady over time. And we haven't seen a lot of change in that division between where development is happening, where people are settling. There has been a lot of activity, some great steps that were taken, actions that were taken in the past year. And I just want to highlight a few, and I won't go through this whole list, but there's been a lot of work done in our jurisdictions around increasing the variety of housing that's available in our cities. So whether that's different kinds of strategies for encouraging middle density housing for duplexes and triplexes in neighborhoods and accessory dwelling units, ways to encourage more density in our urban areas and getting creative with it. We've had some great street improvement projects that improve efficiency and that are also looking at components to make areas more walkable and build in those connections for bicyclists and pedestrians. A huge action in our plan is Intercity Transit extended their zero fare pilot program. Transit boardings are down overall, but we've really found this in the plan that fare-free transit is a huge climate action. It really supports that transition to transit. And so I just want to highlight how important that policy is to continue that for climate change. Olympia did pass their transportation plan, and a piece of that or related to that was shifting to a multimodal concurrency policy that helps really think about the role of bicycling and walking and the role of people, all different users of the transportation system when planning. And that's that's a shift that we highlighted in the climate plan. It supports a lot of the climate actions and identifies improvements to the system that will help it long term. We've also seen a lot of new electric vehicle charging infrastructure going in, especially in the city of Lacey. And there were a couple of great projects that I know you guys have heard of that TRPC was working on, including our gap assessment for sidewalks and the Capitol Campus Travel Demand Project, looking at teleworking at the state campus. So that's sort of where we've been over the past year. At the last meeting of our steering committee that's guiding the climate mitigation plan, they approved the long-term governance agreement that's now going around to the individual jurisdictions. And that agreement sets up for the longer term an agreement among the 4 jurisdictions and TRPC about how they want to coordinate long-term. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. What does it mean to have a long-term governance agreement around climate mitigation and who's sort of making the decisions around climate mitigation in our area? So in the climate mitigation plan, we had actions. We found that there were some actions that you would really need to happen at the state level. There were some actions where we are already working regionally on it. Probably makes sense and is more efficient to work together regionally. A lot of the transportation actions fell into that because we already work regionally on transportation. And there were many actions that would also are best suited or more efficient if they're done by individual jurisdictions. So through permitting regulations, things related to buildings, different programs that jurisdictions run. But there was definitely identified a need to stay in touch, essentially. There are a lot of ways that we can be more efficient if we're working together. And so one jurisdiction might take the lead on something, and it's something the other jurisdictions could learn from. Or there might be opportunities for funding, say, and we may be more competitive if we can get, we can say, hey, we've got 4 jurisdictions that are interested in this, rather than just one jurisdiction trying to go on its own, or 2 jurisdictions maybe even competing against each other. So it was really seen as a way to continue to build momentum for climate action, to stay accountable to each other, and to build these regional solutions, is to continue to partner. So that's what the long-term governance agreement lays out. Thurston County, Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater are partners, jurisdiction partners in this effort, and TRPC is identified as the program coordinator. So it's not TRPC, the council, it's not the Transportation Policy Board, but as staff, we provide the coordination. We're a contractor to those communities to help them continue to come together, talk about what they want to work on together, and facilitate that effort. So just to give you a little more sense of what that looks like, that the goals that were adopted that are part of that interlocal agreement to maintain momentum for local climate action, this group does that. We've got a couple of groups that meet. As I mentioned, there's a steering committee that's made up of elected officials from each of the jurisdictions, and they meet about monthly to kind of coordinate on climate action and their priorities. And there's a team of staff from each of the jurisdictions that are also working a little bit behind the scenes on the nitty-gritty of things that are moving forward. As part of the work program, the steering committee identifies annual, what we're calling regional initiatives, or just sort of priorities of things that they want to work on. For the past year, that focus has been on energy efficiency and carbon sequestration. For this next year, we're going to continue to look at those things, but also there's some work in digging into what might be the costs associated with shifting to electrification, to electric sources in buildings, and what are some overall financing options for the climate mitigation plan. To provide accountability on our progress, one of the big things that TRPC is taking on is tracking our progress on climate mitigation. So putting together that greenhouse gas inventory, doing that implementation tracking, and providing that way to check back and see how we're doing. And then the 4th goal is building public awareness of and engagement in climate mitigation activities. And for that, just keeping people involved. We've got a lot of people with expertise in the community who have some great ideas and insight on how to get this work done. So we'll be putting together for this next year a community advisory group that helps to inform the development of the priorities for this group. And then we put out information all the time through our website, social media, and other we do presentations to community groups that ask for it and that kind of thing. So I'll just wrap it up there, and just to say that there's again, the climate mitigation plan is very focused on what can these 4 jurisdictions do to reduce our contributions to climate change, but there is a role for everyone in the community. It's a huge lift to reach those targets, as I mentioned. And so at I know there's lots of folks who are not necessarily partners in this ILA, but are doing a lot of this work in the community. And there's lots of great examples out there about how to get involved. So I'll just go ahead and stop sharing there and see if folks have any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. We appreciate it. Are there any questions about the presentation? Danny?
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. I just wanted to offer that, you mentioned the multimodal concurrency policy that we have in Olympia. And if it'd be helpful for this group to have any kind of presentation on that, I can volunteer our staff to help with that. I know Sophie's listening. So just if folks are interested. And I'm curious around the measuring our greenhouse gases from year to year. Do we rely on TCAT to do that for us? And do they, like, is there some kind of contract involved in that? Like what does it look like to monitor, the impact that we're having?
Yeah, so the greenhouse gas emissions inventory has been done since I think 2010 by Thurston Climate Action Team, which is a nonprofit group of folks that are interested in climate change. And they've just done it on a voluntary basis. It's one guy. He's got a ton of expertise. He's great. And he digs into, there's just a huge spreadsheet with tons of formulas and things that go into it. And right from the beginning, when we were talking about developing the climate mitigation plan, I think what was recognized is that as this has become a bigger policy driver, that is a little bit of a vulnerability, just having all that knowledge be in one volunteer. And so going forward, the plan under this longer term interlocal agreement is for TRPC to take over that data program. And that way we have the capacity to tie into some of the tools that are available for other jurisdictions that are doing this kind of work and tracking it, and kind of improve it on an annual basis and tie it back to what we're doing. So TCAT has done it in the past. The plan going forward is that TRPC would take over that and it would become part of our overall data and monitoring program.
Got it. Thank you. And I have one more question around, one of the goals being higher adoption of electric vehicles. And what role can we play as governments to help with that, other than making sure that the infrastructure is available? And also, if you could jog my memory, I know there's some kind of assessment around EV charging stations going on. So, the status of that and when we can expect to see something around that.
Yeah, so some of the things we identified in the plan. So electric vehicles is one of these great areas where this is a market transformation that is happening regardless of whether governments get involved or not. At the same time, I think there's so, we were looking at that at the plan saying, well, what really is the role of local government in this transition? And part of that is looking at, is really around that charging infrastructure, making sure that we have consistent standards so that people are set up to have charging infrastructure in their homes. And I think another big piece of it is recognizing that there are some potential equity issues with electric vehicles, and thinking about the market will serve some folks potentially faster and better than others, and where government can get involved is saying, well, who might not be as well served, but we want them to have access to that. And so through programs or incentives or other types of approaches, making sure, one, that it's easy for people if they want to shift to an electric vehicle. It's not like, oh man, I got to tear up my whole garage, or I have to do this, or I have to do that. Like, it should be pretty easy for people to make that choice if they want to. And then making sure that all people have an equal access to that technology.
And are we doing an assessment on EV charging stations and where they're needed? And
right, there is a program at TRPC. I might kick it more to Mark or to Karen to know. I'm not sure exactly what the timeline on that project is, but there is in our work program, we'll be working on an electric vehicle. And
one piece, Allison.
Go ahead, Mark.
One piece, and we presented on this probably 5 2-ish months ago, the state of the system, the ongoing data program that we have, that we looked at current EV charging stations in our area, and there's actually a good interactive map that we created of where those charging stations are. And then starting this year, but more in 2023, we're going to be looking at taking that information and forming it into more of a plan for EV infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. So is that something that comes to us as the Transportation Policy Board, or does it go to the Climate Steering Committee? I get very confused as to what lives where, especially when we have these regional groups working on things, and now there's another one and there's just significant overlap. So.
For the work that I just talked about, that is squarely TRPC. So the state of the transportation system came to you as policy board, and then to also to council, and same with the planning that I'm talking about. That will come to the policy board and to council. It certainly supports the work of the collective climate steering committee, but we're doing this as TRPC led work.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Pete?
Thanks, Sandy. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. Of course, I've been involved in the Transportation Policy Board for years, and I was part of the conversation with the climate plan. And I just want to emphasize that, you know, an important part of the climate plan is something we've already been doing, which is to try to concentrate growth within our urban areas and reduce urban sprawl outside of our urban growth areas. And that's not always an easy thing to do. And, you know, having higher density in our neighborhoods is usually controversial. And I would say that usually it results in having to cut down trees, which is, of course, contrary to the concept of trying to sequester carbon. But I think it's a critical and important thing if we're going to make this plan real and make it happen. And for new elected leaders, you're going to have to buck up and stay the course if you expect us to meet these important needs. The other thing I would say is that, you know, we had a little discussion earlier about the transportation package, and again, it's to really provide an opportunity for people to use alternatives. You've got to build the alternative structure, which means trails, which means bike lanes, which means sidewalks. And that we have not invested as much as we should in that area. And we're going to need to, again, make some tough decisions about our transportation priorities in the future, not only for the purposes of creating an equitable transportation system, but also trying to meet some of these climate goals. And so I think as we look at and we're actually going to have a discussion here in a few minutes on this, as we think about these issues, I think we need to think about them more holistically in terms of the climate impacts, as was stated earlier in the staff presentation. And then the last thing I would just say is you're going to see, and we have seen a lot of emphasis on tree preservation. But I think an equally important tool for meeting our goals here is prairie preservation. Prairies not only sequester carbon, but it'll also, in the case of Tumwater, we're going to have to buy in the city, I shouldn't say we anymore, the city is going to have to purchase 1,500 acres to offset impacts on gopher habitat within the city limits. That's the estimate right now. That will lock up a lot of land that will prevent it from becoming developed in outside the urban growth area. And I think that's an equally important, if not more important, tool towards meeting our climate goals as well. So anyway, I just wanted to emphasize those points. Thank you. Appreciate, Allison, the work you've done in the presentation. We've got a long ways to go here to meet our goals, but I think we've set the framework to do it. It's just we've got to stay the course and if anything, step up our effort to get there. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. I'm gonna call on Brian, but I do want to hit on something you just talked about, in which is the strategy behind complete safe streets. This is something that cities have struggled with for a long time. You know, we have sort of had a focus on roads, right, and preservation of those roads, but we really have counted on the private sector to, when they redevelop, to do the sidewalks, you know, curb gutter, all lighting, all of that. And so that's why we don't see complete streets a lot of places, because you know, the private sector, I don't know why they don't all coordinate and redevelop at the same time, but that doesn't happen. And so I do think there needs to be some sort of emphasis on complete safe streets. It's such a vital part of the livability of our cities as well. And I know there's so many places in Lacey where the sidewalk starts and it ends. And it's not safe. You know, it's not it doesn't get people out and walking because it's not safe. And so it's an emphasis that we've sort of haven't found where, you know, it's so expensive. Everything's so expensive. You know, where do you put your dollars? But I do think there needs to be an emphasis on safe, complete streets. That's for sure. Brian from City of Yelm, you have your hand up.
Yes. I want to say I enjoyed the presentation. Also, being new to this, I'm trying to catch up to try to find a lot of the answers. But I do have some questions to ask in reference to the presentation. And it's just to help me out on understanding and hopefully others to understand as well. One of them is you were talking about the monitoring the greenhouse gases, carbon emissions, things like that. I'm just curious on, is there a actual device out there that is monitoring it and collecting that information, or are we basing it upon the formula of so much electricity is used or so much of this is used that it produces this much carbon? That's one of the questions I have, because I've always felt that we don't give credit when we make improvements and lower our carbon footprint. It seems that our carbon footprint keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but we don't show where a business sits down and puts in things to lower their carbon footprint. So that's my first question I have, and I do have some others to ask in reference to it. So would you like me to ask all the questions, or we go one-on-one?
Let's go one by one.
Okay.
If you don't mind, and then
No, I don't mind at all.
I'll forget.
No,
But-
I like this discussion. It's very important that we have these discussions.
That's an excellent question, and definitely one that I get, because it looks like no. The answer is no. We don't measure directly the emissions. It's a proxy kind of thing where it wouldn't even, if we were to measure, for example, in just kind of atmospheric concentrations, we wouldn't be able to break it down into what are we doing locally. So the way that the monitoring program works is it does look at things like how much energy are we using. We get information from Puget Sound Energy to say, you know, how much energy did their residential customers in Thurston County use each year? How much did industrial customers use? And how much did commercial customers use? And then there are a series of formulas and assumptions that are put in about how that translates into emissions. Same thing for transportation. It's based on how many vehicle miles traveled happened in our region for our year. And we think about things like, do we count people who are driving on I-5 and who go straight through Thurston County and don't stop? Do those count or not count? One thing that I think we're hoping to do by taking on the greenhouse gas inventory into our monitoring program is to dig into those assumptions a little bit more and really think about those dials and how changes in our community would apply to what we see. So for example, one thing that in working on the inventory for the climate mitigation plan, one of our sectors is around solid waste. And our solid waste goes to the Roosevelt landfill, but they have done a lot of work around being pretty innovative in capturing methane, in doing things that reduce their emissions. And so, you know, in digging that apart, we found that we could change some of the assumptions based on action that's been taken locally. And so we're hoping that, as we dig into that inventory and understand all the levers that are in there, we'll really be able to better communicate through the inventory local changes that we're making, just like you said.
Okay, I appreciate that. I mean, because hearing that, you brought up how PSC, they produce energy through natural and coal. My understanding is that the coal plants that PSC has used, in particular in Washington, have almost gone down to zero. And so I'm wondering why we're still including that when you're talking about how we're polluting.
Yeah, so under the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which is state law, there are timelines for PSE and all energy producers providing electricity to Washington state to shift toward 100% renewable electricity. PSE's largest source for coal and Thurston County, we get our power mostly from PSE. So that one of their biggest sectors comes from a coal plant in Montana. And so it's outside of Washington state. So it is true that the largest coal-fired power plant in Washington state has shut down, and that's no longer part of our power grid, but there are other sources that are feeding into that. But there is a transition plan. PSE is working really hard to achieve the benchmarks in this bill.
Another coffee when you can.
Sorry, someone was not on mute there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem.
Okay.
You have
Let's see.
another quick question?
Yes, I do. As I say, it's because, and I apologize for being late to the game. I'm trying to understand. We talk about the,
if, Brian, if you want, we can set a meeting with you and Allison and get you. I know there's a lot of questions, and I know a lot of the Transportation Policy Board has been up on this, but I think we should, maybe.
Okay.
We can
I would love to do that then. As I say, I'm trying to understand because just to let you know, my background is I've worked not necessarily in the energy field as the energy person. I've through my college experiences and doing some internships, I've learned about the energy grid and a lot of the questions in reference to this. And there's a lot of assumptions that when I talk to a lot of people about it, that they all of a sudden go, oh, did not know, or we aren't monitoring that, or, so I just want to find out if we are.
Allison, if you can maybe reach out to Brian and you can go in depth on some of these questions. And then Brian, obviously you can come back and, maybe report out some of it,
And I appreciate
Sound good?
I appreciate that opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Georgie, your hands up as well.
Yes, it is.
Go for it.
I just have a question for Allison on the 3.3 metric tons of pollution and the percent of increase. How does that compare nationally?
Do you mean?
How are we doing compared to the nation as a whole?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I think it's pretty consistent that nationally our emissions have also been going up. One thing I would note is we also look at per capita emissions, so kind of the average per person. And nationally, I think per capita emissions have been increasing. And in Thurston County, it's interesting, our per capita emissions, I believe, they go up and down a little bit. The last year they went up, but over time they're holding pretty steady, which is pretty interesting for us because we've seen a lot of population growth. So although our overall emissions have been going up, our per capita emissions have been holding pretty steady. So that's great. That's kind of one thing. And I think that's a little bit different compared to nationally. And also for Washington state as a whole.
I just checked quickly while we were on this conference call, the national figures, and the national figures seem to be lower than ours, but I could be wrong on that.
Now, if you just pulled it up, I haven't looked at the national ones in a little while. I've been focused a little more locally. So there you go.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I don't see any other hands up. I do want to pass along a conversation I just had with the Lacey Youth Council last Tuesday. It's been interesting talking to our youth council and hearing their priorities. And for the past several years, our youth council's #1 priority has been climate change. And so I sort of dug in a little bit deeper with them and said, why is this a priority? Why are you so passionate about this issue? And they have commented that they know that where we're headed and the goals that we need to achieve, the 45% below the 2015 levels and the 85% below the 2015 levels by 2050. And so they feel like the clock is ticking, right? And that their generation is going to have to come up with solutions for this. And it's a point of stress for them. Like every day that goes by, they feel like, what's the plan? What's the plan? And they're so passionate about it because they feel like their generation's gonna be affected the most by it. And so it was just, I hadn't really thought about it in those terms of why our youth in general are so passionate about this issue year after year. And so that, when you think about in those terms, when you think about, if the clock is ticking, you better get going. And they feel that, I think more than past generations do for sure. So, I just wanted to add that, and maybe it helps us understand our youth a little bit more and why they're so serious about climate change. With that, let's go on to our next agenda item, which is our transportation priority survey.
Good morning, everyone. So this is going to be a little bit of a different presentation. Usually when we report back on surveys, we're talking about the numbers of what people said. And this time we're going to take a step back and look at kind of the methods that we went through and how people responded from different avenues that we reached out to them through. So over last year, between June and December, we held this transportation priority survey. And I guess the first question is, why did we even bother to do this? And really, the first piece was looking at incorporating equity more fully into the work that we do, and it's specifically for the call for projects process. So Vina will be talking a little bit more about that later today. The second piece was talking about telework and changing commute patterns. We are living through a pandemic, which has radically changed how we work and live and interact with one another. And so we are seeing changes in how people travel and when they travel and why they travel. And then finally, the last piece of this is really understanding and testing survey methods. So we've heard a lot from policy board as well as council that we need to be doing more to reach out to our entire community. And so this is kind of a first effort to say, okay, well, what can we actually achieve when we are doing a survey like this? Who are we reaching out to? Who's being left out? And how can we accommodate or focus in on those voices that are maybe less heard? So we asked people about COVID and commuting, about transportation access, job access, project funding priorities. So what's important to them that we actually fund through the money that we have here at TRPC, that comes through TRPC. We also asked about their big picture values and of course, equity. We began the process by sending a postcard to every household with an invitation to tell us what's important to them. The postcard included language in both English and Spanish and provided a link to the project website and a QR code to the online survey. So this survey was primarily conducted online. This is the other side, or what you would see if you went to the website. It has language in English, but it also has language in other languages. So Spanish, Korean, and Vietnamese are the three most common languages spoken at home in Thurston County besides English. So we proactively had the survey translated into Spanish and included the invitation to take the survey in both English and Spanish. And then we also included language on the project website in Korean and Vietnamese that invited people who desired the survey to be translated into another language to reach out. So this was a pretty monumental effort. We heard from a lot of people through the survey effort, and it's really in no small part due to our community partnerships. Many of these partnerships represent agencies that are part of the council, and others represent trusted community organizations that don't sit on this on council or policy board, but who we all work with on a regular basis. We reached out to many more organizations that are represented on this slide. We had individuals and agencies share social media posts, email staff and community members. We had folks help us get mailed surveys out with water bills and get the word out through other means. Just a few that I would like to highlight are, we worked with the Housing Authority of Thurston County to reach out to the people that they serve, as well as people on their wait list for housing. We also reached out to the Chehalis tribe, and they were gracious enough to send an email to their staff and tribal members. And we got a really good response rate from people who are of Native American descent. And I have no doubt it is in large part because of their ability and reach to do that. Timberland Regional Library posted posters and had paper surveys available for people to fill out. So, it's through all of these different ways that people helped out that we got the reach that we did. So speaking of that reach, we sent more than 126,000 postcards out. We heard from just over 4,000 people who responded to the survey. And we also heard from 499 students. So backtracking a little bit, we also reached out to our school districts in Thurston County, asking for their help to reach out to their high school student population. And this is a really difficult time for our school districts in managing how they respond to COVID and ensuring that all children get an education that they are required to provide. And so we didn't hear back from everyone. We heard back from two school districts, Yelm School District and Olympia School District, and that's phenomenal. So between those two school districts, we heard from nearly 500 high school students. And that gives us a good mix of students in both rural and urban areas, and gives us, I think a really good balance of what we could have heard from all high school students in all districts. So 780, if you look at this, we've got, as part of the survey, we asked people about some of their demographic information. And we had a really, again, a pretty good response rate to help us understand where people lived, their gender and age, as well as their race and ethnicity and their household income. And in addition to all of this, we also heard from 787 respondents that indicated they had a disability affecting their mobility. So when we pulled out all this demographic information, we've gotten such a good response rate from folks that we're able to say, okay, well, how are people, what's the priority for people who have an income less than $35,000 a year? What's the priority for our seniors or our younger members of the community? What are the priorities for people who live in rural areas versus those that live in more urban areas? And so even though we haven't heard from everyone and there might be differing rates of response based on these different demographic pieces, we're able to tease out from that information what these different groups are feeling or thinking. So in addition to the general survey that invited all members of the community to participate, as I mentioned earlier, we talked to students. We also worked through other bodies to try and reach out to lower income folks, as well as seniors, and as well as people of color. So the big question is, I think we get asked this a lot, is how many responses do we need in order to trust survey results represent the population? So when I say we sent over 126,000 postcards to every household in the county, and we heard from just a little over 4,000 people, what does that actually mean? Well, these are some examples of surveys that you hear or are in national headlines that talk about different things. And what you see here is their sample size and with the total population that they relate to. So these surveys each match and weigh responses to the population at large. And I think what's most important to note here is that the percent of the total populations the survey sampled. In each case, less than 1/100% of the population are represented to provide insight into what the general population believes. So let's compare this to what we did with the Transportation Priority Survey. This is somewhat of an apples and oranges comparison to the previous slide because our results are based on people self-reporting and self-reporting their demographics. And those national surveys have the ability to tighten that information down and have it as part of their results. So that said, even though they're using different methods, we're still talking about the same thing. And we're asking for the information and using a different process to analyze it. So again, what's important to note here is the percent of the total population the survey sampled. In each case, more than 0.5% of each demographic group represented to provide insight into what that specific group believes. So this is much higher than what we would get with those national surveys shown on the previous slide. I do want to note that on this slide, we talk about people aged 10 to 24. So while over 83,000 Thurston County residents are 24 and younger, we recognize that our youngest residents aren't necessarily going to be taking this survey. And so taking into consideration the student survey responses, nearly all respondents 24 and younger were actually between the ages of 14 and 24. Unfortunately, we can't accurately track that age bracket, 14 to 24, because of the way the US Census Bureau reports age and because we didn't ask students to provide their age. So what we do know is that nearly 50,000 people in Thurston County are between the ages of 10 and 24, and that 547 of the survey respondents, so the student survey as well as the primary survey, were likely between the ages of 14 and 24. So collectors, tracking how people access the survey. So a collector is really just, again, a way to track how people access the survey. We established more than 10 different collectors to help us track how people got to the survey and heard about the survey. So we had a number of survey or collectors that just weren't used, but these are the primary ones. We did that postcard mailing. We had both a general collector set up and a survey or Spanish collector set up. We had an active transportation, one for the food bank, housing authority, and senior housing, which all were paper surveys, and then that student survey. So what you see here is a breakdown of, how many people responded through these different methods. And we heard from nearly half of our respondents through that postcard mailing. Really had a pretty good reach. But our general collector, which, talked to people on the climate change mailing list, as well as our internal TRPC mailing lists and other aspects. We heard from about 20% of our respondents. Same idea with our active transportation. So this is the mailing list or contacts who are advocates and users that are walking and biking. Food bank and housing authority and senior paper surveys were a little bit less, but it was a pretty critical piece when you're talking about lower income households. And then again, that student survey, kind of higher than what we did with the housing authority and the food bank, but really concentrated on the youth in the community. So as I mentioned, we talked to asked people about demographics. And so how do response rates for various demographics compare to Thurston County's actual population? So how well did we do reaching out to different demographic groups? So I'm just going to concentrate on 4 today. There's a lot of information and it will probably take a lot longer to get through this presentation. So we'll look at age, race and ethnicity, household income, and disability affecting mobility. So people under the age of 55 are underrepresented in the survey results. If we pulled those student results out from that group 10 to 24, we only heard from 48 people between the ages of 10 and 24, and that's a 1% response rate. So what we learn here is that we are still having difficulty reaching out to the younger demographics in our community. Household income, people with a household income less than 35,000 were also underrepresented. We did pretty good hitting those middle income folks, so 35,000 to 75,000. And most households at that lower income level are really struggling to make ends meet, and transportation is a factor in how they live and how they access goods and services. So this one shows what we heard from people of different races and ethnicities. So again, I want to note that we got a really good response rate from people who are American Indian and Alaska Natives. And that's, again, in no small part because of the help of the Chehalis tribe of reaching out to their tribal members and employees. So that looks like a very small number, but it is seriously one of the best results that we've had in the surveying that we've done in recent years. But as you can see, people of color are underrepresented in the survey. We're doing better, I think, than in previous survey efforts, but we still have a good long way to go to make sure that we are hearing from all people in our community. And disability affecting mobility. So this is something that we asked specifically what kind of disabilities that people had that affected their mobility. Obviously, I think it's pretty obvious that bicycling and walking were probably the most common. But really, when we went through the responses, 1 in 5 people indicated that they had a disability affecting their mobility. And that impacts how they are able to travel, what modes they are able to use. So moving back to those collectors, so how people access the survey, let's see how people, what responses we got from those different demographic groups from each collector. And so what you see is that our respondents aged 10 to 24, nearly everyone came in through that student collector. And that means that it was students, not necessarily our younger adults, 18 to 24. A good portion of folks, regardless of their other demographic factors, really came in through that postcard mailing. But we also had a really good outreach through our active transportation. So our email lists for people who walk and bike, as well as that postcard or the food bank and housing authority survey. So we see some differences in how people access based on their different demographic groups. So it's not necessarily that we want to lose any one of these methods. It's each one of these methods really help to create a richer environment for people to provide their answers and ideas. So we asked people, and this is where I'm just going to go into a couple of questions on the survey, but we asked people how strongly they agreed or disagreed with our equity goal. And so this equity goal is something that both you as the Transportation Policy Board, as well as the council reviewed last year as we were coming up to this process. And so what we see here is that for the most part, most people actually agree with the equity goal that we had crafted. We also asked people why they had disagreed or agreed with the response. And these are just some responses that we've had for people who disagree. So more than 2,000 people provided additional thoughts on transportation and why they disagree or disagree with the equity goal. So here are a few of them for folks that disagreed or strongly disagreed with the equity goal. In this case, I want to note that quotes are edited for grammar and punctuation, and they all come from respondents who identified themselves as a person of color. And these are responses or a few thoughts from people who agreed or strongly agreed with the equity goal. Once again, quotes are edited for grammar and punctuation, and these also came from people who identified themselves as a person of color. So what's the bottom line? How much did this cost? About 80% of the survey costs are associated with actually doing the postcard mailing. So it costs a little over $45,000, give or take, to do this survey. I want to note that this does not include the cost of staff time. So we spent quite a bit of time before we sent out the survey, crafting the questions. Staff spent time prepping the postcards and getting it to the distributor for mailing. We had staff sending out paper surveys to various agencies for distribution. So there's a lot of background work that went into this that you aren't necessarily seeing, as well as time we're spending actually analyzing the information that we heard from people. The other thing I want to note is, again, we had a lot of good help from a lot of community partners, and the time that they spent in assisting us with this is also not reflected in this. But when you're just talking about those hard costs about paper and mailing and postage and translations, we're looking at about $45,000. And as we've gone through this, we've also thought about what are some other things that we need to be thinking about. How cost effective is it to administer a survey the way that we did? How can we improve outreach to those who speak a language other than English? And have we done enough to remove bias introduced into the data by using demographic responses? So next is, what do we do with the results that we've gotten? Survey results will be used to inform 10 different projects. Primarily, again, we went into this with the idea that this would help inform a call for projects process. But as we took all the information in and started analyzing it and talked internally with staff and the number of projects that we're working on, we identified, a lot more opportunities to incorporate this information into the work that we do. So some of these projects are part of our core work program, while others are projects we work on with partners. And a good example of that is the hazards mitigation plan. We're also working on that high capacity transportation study. So there's just a lot of good benefit. This is kind of a different way for us to take a survey and utilize it. Normally what we do is a survey is a one-off, it's associated with one project, and then it's done. And so this is a really great opportunity for us to build the information that we have, are getting from our community into the projects, many of the projects that we're already working on. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Don?
Yeah, number one, I really want to acknowledge the work you've done. It's really pretty thorough. But I often wonder for these kind of things, do you sort of compare how you did what you did with other comparable regional communities to get some sense of how we stack up in terms of effort expended and results got?
Actually, a little bit. So we met with staff from PSRC a few months ago because they were going through a surveying effort for their update of their regional transportation plan, just to understand how they were doing and the response rates that they get. Now, they ended up using a consultant for their work, and I don't remember all the hard numbers, but I want to say that they spent about $180,000 on their process with the consultant, and they're surveying a larger area than we are, and they got 1,800 responses, if I remember. So I don't want to say that the way we did things is better or worse. It's just different because they're going through a different process than we are.
Thank you.
Peter?
So just a suggestion on to get a better response rate. You said that you surveyed some age group from 14 to 10 to 21, but primarily 14 to, is it 20?
14 to 20.
So 40 to 20. So what that tells me is that if you had focused on giving them a postcard or a message, say, give this to your parent when you get home, you would have gotten a little bit more information than just focusing on them alone, because I don't recall getting the survey. And you said that you sent survey through through a bit and stuff like that. So most of us that have online account don't necessarily open our sewer bill. We just go pay. So that's an opportunity lost because COVID has now, and everything is not normal like it used to be. You get your bill, you know what you're supposed to pay. You just don't open it because you go pay. So just suggestion.
No, that's a good one. I'll just to piggyback on what you said, for a survey that we did in the Rochester area, we actually worked through the schools to the Rochester School District to distribute a parent survey, and we did get a pretty good response rate through that method. So that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah. Danny?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So awesome that you worked with the Chehalis tribe. Was there any outreach to Squaxin and Nisqually in terms of reaching out to their tribal members and employees as well?
So we did reach out to Nisqually. I don't believe that we reached out to the Squaxin.
Okay.
But yes, we did reach out to the Nisqually tribe as well.
Okay, I think in the future that Squaxin should be included because you know, Thurston County, there are 3 tribes that have an interest here, and though Squaxin's reservation is in Mason County, like they do have tribal members that definitely live in Thurston County and drive around, and who knows, maybe you reach out and you don't hear back, but it's always good to put that out there. And I'm sorry if you covered this in the presentation, I missed it, but how many surveys were taken in Spanish?
3.
3? Oh, okay. And were there any requests for translation for Korean or Vietnamese?
Nope.
Okay. And also something to consider for future surveys is whether somebody rents or owns the place that they live, because that has different implications in terms of how people's costs change over time, especially with the cost of rent going up, and transportation costs are also a part of our monthly budgets. So, something to consider in terms of getting around different issues of equity with this. So thank you. Well,
I definitely think we need to take these surveys as just one of the tools, like in our toolbox, right? I mean, it's pretty difficult to come up with a really good policy based around a survey because number one, it is a smaller percentage of our population who's weighing in, and the people who take surveys are usually people who will take the time to do a survey, all right, who are more active, who has an opinion, has a voice, wants to express that. That is not necessarily a representative of the population as a whole either. And so this is a tool that we have to look to see if we're our policies are sort of going along the ways where our more activist side of our community is where they're at as well. So, surveys are always difficult that way. Who's responding, how they can respond. We're obviously missing out for on the BIPOC community. And that is a direct result of years not specifically reaching out to that community, right? You need direct communication, and you need to be deliberate to do that. And that's not something surveyors, people who do these surveys have done a lot of in the past. So, I think it's a good reminder that there's some really good information in here, but it's just one of the tools that we have to help to make decisions. And we received this was a grant that we got, right, to do this work.
No, I believe it came out of our budget. Mark, can you? confirm that?
That's correct.
So we just budgeted it and did it out of our budget. Okay.
Correct.
Is there any other questions? Seeing none, then let's go on to our call for project. Whoop. Anyone? Okay, let's go on to our call for projects equity.
Thank you. So I'm Vina Tabbitt. Again, I'm the Deputy Director here at TRPC. We've got some new faces. So I am going to review a little bit of what I talked about last month about our federal call for projects, and then do a deeper dive into how we're integrating equity into our call for projects. And luckily, Katrina covered quite a bit of a deep dive of how we collected our information. So I would like to say that we've coordinated these presentations. Not exactly true, but it really worked out well in this case. So one of the very, very important things you all do as a board is you make a recommendation on how we program out federal money for our region, as we are what is called a Metropolitan Planning Organization, an MPO, and a Regional Transportation Planning Organization. And with that, we receive through the State Department of Transportation an allocation of funding that we then serve as the body that asks for proposals and then programs out money. We don't touch the money. It is all handled through the Department of Transportation, but we are the policy base of how the money gets distributed. And it's money for a large variety of transportation related projects. And that's when we call a federal call for transportation projects, that's what we're talking about. And we've done this for many, many years. So we have embarked on updating our call for projects process, and that's what this presentation is part of. It's part of a series of presentations talking about how we are going about doing that. We talked to you all in April of last year with an overview of how we were going to approach updating our call for projects. And then we've been working with something called our Technical Advisory Committee. For those of you new to the board, that is a committee made up of the staff from our local jurisdictions, mainly transportation and engineering, transportation planning and engineering staff from our local jurisdictions, and member partners who have transportation and engineering staff. As Katrina mentioned, we have also done a large amount of outreach to mainly with the focus of how to update this call for projects. We thought the survey would take a few months, very optimistic there, that we ended up doing a much extended it for that deeper outreach because it just took a lot of time to prepare paper surveys and work with our partners and get the word out. Totally well worth it, as you saw from the results. Of all the surveys, and I've been here over 22 years, this is the one that we really were able to reach out deeper and get a really much fuller picture of our community and what they were thinking. So now through the winter and the spring of this year, we will be coming to you with what we've learned and talking about this call for projects update. And then hopefully by May or June, we'll have everything settled and it'll be recommended by you all and adopted by our council. You're an advisory board to our council. And then in next fall, we will get our next call for projects started. So why are we doing this update? If we've been doing this for 20 some years, maybe more, why do we need to update the process? Well, we've heard from you all and our council that you wanted to provide a more direct tie to our performance goals and targets. We've developed a lot of goals. You saw Allison Osterberg present about our climate goals, and we've adopted that as a region as well. We did that first in around 2013 or so, 2012, 2013, and then just to refresh that. We wanted to provide a competitive process, and it's always been a competitive process, but with clear and transparent project eligibility and evaluation criteria. We are potentially, depending on census numbers that we are waiting to hear from, which we in the next 4 or 5 months we should hear, we potentially could move from what is a metropolitan planning organization to a transportation management area. We have to hit 200,000 people in our urbanized area. We think we will, but at the federal level, they are redefining what an urbanized area is. So we don't know if we will or not. We would have if they weren't redefining it. But so it's one of those things with federal new statutes and things that we just have to wait to see what comes out of that. But if we do, then our organization and our entire transportation work program will be undergoing a certification, which is a much higher degree of scrutiny. And so we want to get ready for that. And so we're taking steps to be ready to say, this is our process. Here it's outlined. It's extraordinarily clear, and you can see how it's competitive and open and transparent.
Vina, what's the difference between an MPO and that?
A TMA?
Yeah.
Mark and I can come back and give you a briefing on that, Chair. There's quite a few components of it, and so I'm just in the interest of time.
Sure, that's a pretty big deal, though. So
Yeah.
It'd be nice because it's going to obviously have a huge impact on the Transportation Policy Board. So
Yes,
maybe
one of the biggest
let-
differences is we'll receive more direct funding. That federally, the funding comes to us, and DOT doesn't have a say on how much we get. So that's one of the reasons we're really focusing on this. But yes, we will absolutely brief you as we learn more and uncover more. It's like unwrapping a present. There's layers and layers of it because it's changing. Okay, so the third purpose, and this is a really important one, is to continue to position our region to meet our obligation targets. And that is the State Department of Transportation every year says you have to work with your partners to get this much money under contract. And if you do, and other folks can't get their money under contract, you might be able to get that. And that's called redistributed funding. Other folks within the state and other folks from out of the state. And I think last month I came to you and let you know that we had $1.58 million of funding that came to our region because that came from other partners that we were able to then reprogram out on more projects. So it's very, very important for us to do that because it means we can get more money for transportation projects. So our general concept in this call for project is be very clear about our project priorities. These are priorities we've had for a long time, but especially explicitly safety, efficiency, and maintenance have been the ones we've talked about for a long time. We have added planning, resiliency, and active transportation. It is not that we didn't fund planning, resiliency, and active transportation projects in the past. We absolutely have. We're just being more open and transparent about the categories of funding. And we have worked with our technical advisory committee to really say, well, how would these projects, how do you show that these are your local priorities? Are they in your local plans? Where do these projects come from? Because we want to be very thoughtful about the projects that are put forward. Of course, there are federal eligibility requirements. Most of those will remain the same, but we're under a new federal transportation bill, so there might be some tweaks around the edges. For instance, some of these projects for some sources of money can only be on our higher use roadways, that sort of thing. Then we, to tie us to goals and performance measures, we came up with regional priorities, and there's 4 of those. We talked about 3 of these last month, the efficient use of federal funding, meeting our goals for sustainable Thurston corridors and centers. And Allison Osterberg's presentation on climate talked a little bit about our goals of trying to get more housing in our urban areas located near our urban corridors and centers, and how we weren't quite reaching those goals. So the idea is if we make transportation investments in these areas, we would be helping to meet the goals for our land use. Allison also talked about the climate plan and our greenhouse reduction goals and how we were moving slightly the wrong direction in meeting those goals, and how transportation transportation is responsible for about 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why we brought that into this call for projects, saying, well, we could put our money where our goals are. How can we select projects that move us towards our goals? And so what we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about today is how the equity criteria would be worked into this. That this has been a very large focus of your work and our council's work, and asking us to look at that. And then finally, we'll come back to you and talk about set-asides and funding caps and possibly match requirements, some of the nitty-gritty that goes behind the program. But that'll come in the future months when we learn a little bit more about how much funding we're going to be expecting in the next years, and specific set-asides that the federal government may require us to do. Okay. That's your background, and thank you for bearing with me for those of you that were here last month, but with some new members, I think it's important to bring you all up to the same level of understanding. And like everything else, we are happy to dive deeper with you individually if you have tons of questions, and you may. Okay, for equity consideration, so how do we go about integrating equity into our call for projects? And we have been thinking about this and researching this for a long time, for a couple of years. We knew this was very important to you, and we've been reading lots of how other folks are doing it, participating in webinars. It really has been a strong focus. So a lot of background research and thinking about this. We drafted an equity goal, brought that to you last year, and then put that on the survey that Katrina just talked about and did a community check-in. We've been thinking about the types of equity. Equity isn't just a one size fits all. And that's why it's so complicated when we're talking about this. But we also want to make this somewhat simple, because one of our goals with the call for projects is having a clear and transparent process. We want our partners to see how their project will rank up as they're developing the project and doing the forms. We don't want to put a lot of red tape around it. We want to get that money out and program it to the great projects that our region has without adding a lot of red tape. We have a bunch of eligible project types that we just talked about. We want to do a community check-in on what they thought about those project types. And we also have been doing a lot of thinking about benefits and burdens of individual projects. So there's project types, and then there's the individual project and how it's shaped. So those are all kind of the range of things that we were looking at. So part of our background research, there was actually a pretty intensive study that came out just last year, I believe, that looked at how do other organizations tackle this. They asked the specific question that we're trying to tackle to metropolitan planning organizations across the country. Their conclusions were a little vague and unsatisfying. Basically, it varies. And we're all grappling with this, is what I kind of learned from reading it. Lots of great examples of how you could approach it, including set aside specific funding for equity projects, that sort of thing, to, well, just a huge amount of approaches. And it really was about the broader the local context. It really had to fit locally and our planning environment. And that's great. I mean, that means we should develop our projects and our criteria to fit our community, which we would have done anyway, but it's nice to hear that. The third conclusion, though, that we take very seriously is public involvement is imperative during these processes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also took a deeper dive into an equity and transportation planning study. And one of their conclusions is that it's really important to have a clear understanding of what is meant by transportation equity, that the words equity, equality, all of that can mean something different to everybody. And so that's one of the reasons we started working on our transportation goal and did the outreach with our survey. Katrina talked a little bit about the transportation survey and the goal, and she is still doing a deeper dive into the comments, and we'll be bringing that information back to you. The idea of the goal is to be put into our regional transportation plan when we update that in coming years. So I'm not going to really do a deep dive into it. It's the same goal that she talked about. The goal that we asked folks to comment on was provide equitable transportation access and service for people of all ages, races and ethnicities, incomes, abilities, English language proficiencies, and other demographic characteristic as appropriate for the community's land use characteristics, urban, suburban, and rural. That last bit of the sentence is an acknowledgement that we can't provide, and we should not provide, or try to provide the same opportunities in rural areas as we may in urban areas. For an example, our transit service is really focused on our urban areas. And so there's just there's a context that goes with our land use and how we provide transportation services and infrastructure to support different types of land use. We also provided this nifty little diagram that talked about the difference between equality and equity and just our definitions of those words. Equality meaning that each individual or group of people is given the same resources, opportunities. So it's all very well to say, let's make it the same for everyone, but that may not fit. A child, for instance, may not be able to ride a bike the same size as an adult. Where equity recognizes everyone has different circumstances and allocates those resources and opportunities to reach an equal outcome. So like I said, Katrina will be coming back more about talking about the goal and policies that go beyond to support that in future meetings. I see I have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to wrap this up in 5, so at least I can take a few questions. Okay, so the types of equity we're talking about, there's procedural equity, which is really focused on the degree of involvement of diverse public stakeholders in the process for decision making. We are tackling that by looking at the survey, but another way you all will be talking next month about your community and business reps, and having diverse voices on this board will also help with procedural equity. Geographic equity is about focusing the distributions across geography and space. So making sure that we have projects in all parts of our community, and we've always done a very good job at that. And then social equity is focusing across population groups that can be equal or differ by income, social class, or mobility ability. And that's oftentimes that's what people think about when they think about equity. Okay, so for procedural equity, we looked at the input from survey, and we asked folks to mark how important the following types of studies, projects, and programs are to you. And I think we had 27 categories or 27 specific types of projects, and those are these listed over here under these general categories. Then we looked at how all respondents prioritized and said, what are the top 5 for all respondents? And you can see these are the ones that popped out. But we also took a deeper dive into different demographic groups. So we looked at respondents of colors, and you're going to see the same type of things pop up for that with some changes around the edges. We did the same for household with incomes less than 35,000. So again, what are the top 5 for this group? Respondents who have transportation barriers. You're seeing safety keep popping up in planning and studies. Who have job barriers. We're seeing a lot of the same types of projects pop up, and then folks who have a disability affecting mobility. Oh, actually, this slide didn't get hidden. So let's see. So just from the top of my head, the ones that popped up were conduct planning studies, these 3 under safety, and then under maintenance was increase road maintenance, and then under active transportation was add sidewalks and safe crossings to existing streets. I apologize for that. Oh, there it is. Okay, they're all, that's how that slide was done. Sorry. So we use that as part of our criteria, and I'll talk about that in just a second, and said, okay, so those projects, because they have popped up with 3 out of 5 underserved groups, should get an extra equity point in our call for projects. Then looking at geographic equity, we decided we'll address this with our funding caps and just make sure that when we develop this call for projects, we will get funding distributed to all our partners. That's really important to us. And then social equity, we also thought, well, it's really important to look at project-specific benefits and burdens. And if a project has a specific benefit to an underserved population, either by the project design or location, that they would receive a bonus point. But if they had a burden, they would receive a negative point. And for an example of a benefit, let's say we have a project that proposes to build a sidewalk in a school area. That would get 1 point because it's a priority project. It's already been selected by 3 of the 5 underserved groups as a project that they think is important. But if that particular project was also in a school district or school area that had a high proportion of free and reduced lunch students, so economically disadvantaged area, it would get that bonus point because it's really directly serving an underserved population. An example of a burden would be a project that really precluded the ability for active transportation. So let's say a project was proposed and didn't have completes in the urban area and didn't have the active transportation that was consistent with the city's complete streets policy. Then we would say, well, that you're really precluding the opportunity to get those active transportation elements in there. And so that we really want to see projects that don't do that, don't provide a burden. So that's how we're proposing our point system. 1 point if the project's in that top 5 list that I talked about. Another point if it has a demonstrable benefit to an underserved population, and -1 point if it has a disproportionate burden to an underserved population. Fairly simple. A lot of work went behind it though, and so we're happy to hear your thoughts. And so the next steps then would just be coming back to you, talking about the funding set-asides and caps, going for public comment, and then getting this process approved and having a call for projects next fall. And I'm going to stop my sharing.
Almost 9 o'clock. Is there any quick questions on the work that's been done? Seeing none, do you have an outside committee report, Danny?
Sure. Actually, I figured we were going to run out of time. And so let me just go to that part of my notes. I did attend the Puget Sound Regional Council Transportation Policy Board meeting where they are looking at their process for their call for projects and their criteria. And it was really fascinating for me personally. I took like 3 pages of notes and was just focused and listening in on the whole conversation, just in terms of how things are done differently up north than they are down here. And I won't get into the nitty gritty details that they're going through, their process, we're going through ours. But I will say one thing that I thought was really cool about the group was how they talked about the level of collaboration. They have so many more jurisdictions that are involved in the Puget Sound Regional Council. It's enormous. But the way that they spoke about everyone feeling heard, giving some in some places and getting things in other places. It was just really, really respectful dialogue up there. And so I'm going to continue to represent us up there. I'm learning a lot. And that's pretty much all for my report. Probably not terribly interesting, but like I said, they're in the middle of process just like we are. So when they start making some decisions around that, I'll have some more clear information for you.
Great, thank you, Danny. Well, with that, we've reached the end of our objections. Thanks for everyone hanging there for this longer meeting, but we have some really great information that we need to share. So really appreciate you all. Till next time, without objection, I'll call this meeting adjourned. See ya.
Thank you all.